Welcome to Webinar 3. This session will cover Learning Outcome 3, which is understand how to overcome common challenges faced by procurement and supply chain managers. The learning outcomes are specifically to look at sources of power, 3.1. 3.2 is influencing, tactics, and 3.3 is about equality and diversity. So this is a nice compact learning outcome, is learning outcome 3. So just to recap, sources of power, how to influence stakeholders, and analyse how equality and diversity issues relate to the supply chain. So firstly, why do we need to use power and influence in supply chains? Many reasons: securing cooperation, resolving stakeholder conflicts, maintaining quality standards, cost reduction initiatives, ethical standards, securing compliance, etc., etc. So many challenges that require use of power and influence in supply chains or procurement. Where does power come from? Well, at an organisational level, there are 3 levels of analysis as proposed by Fincham. We can see power as being processual, where it emerges out of the daily interaction in organisations. That is, how power is gained and used in the ongoing game of developing and implementing strategy. It stresses power as negotiation and bargaining, and the enactment of rules and how resources are employed in the power game. So it comes out of the, if you like, the processes of running a company, but power can also come from the institutional level. It's related to radical theories of power such as Marxist theory insist ultimately power is constituted in social and economic structures and institutions external to the organisation. So when managers seek to exercise power, they can draw on the institutionally produced rules such as cultural beliefs about the right to manage. Perhaps a more straightforward one now is power can be seen as coming from internal or organisational aspects. The organisational level stresses the organisation's own power systems and hierarchy as a means of reproducing power. Dominant beliefs, values, knowledge shape organisation priorities and solutions. Those in authority select others to sustain existing power structures, and the hierarchies transmit power between institutional interests and rules. Fairly complex stuff there. It's been in the unit content since it first came out in 2013, and this was examined for the first time in July 18. So it's one we've got to be careful with, that we can't assume that it won't be examined again. So at an organisational viewpoint, 3 views of power: processual, institutional, and organisational. General forms and uses of power. Power can be overt, covert, subtle, hidden, and it can be also structural power built into the situational context or relationship. Sources of power. Where does power come from? Well, French and Raven identified 5 bases of power. This should be familiar with you from your studies at level 4. This is very heavily examined in this particular unit, and most good answers would refer to the French and Raven framework. So this one is an absolute essential for students to learn and learn well. So the 5 bases or sources of power: reward power, which is, as it says, the ability to allocate desirable outcomes, salary increases, increased business, shared benefits. So reward power, straightforward. Coercive power, a bit more Negative, based on the distribution of undesirable outcomes, so coercive power is used to enforce maybe deadlines, punish, scare, and in the supply chain it could be decreasing business or dictating cost reductions. A more straightforward one is legitimate power, which is sometimes referred to as positional power, and it comes from the position that you hold in the organisation, such as supply chain manager. A manager who leads his team has certain responsibilities and also the right to delegate tasks, as well as review their work and give feedback. So power can come from your position within the organisation. One that perhaps is more related to leadership is power can come from referent or charismatic areas, and this is where somebody has power, but it isn't because of their position necessarily, it isn't because of their reward, it is because perhaps someone's highly admired, ability to convey a sense of personal acceptance. It's held that people with charisma, integrity and other positive qualities, and it's the most valuable type of power. And in supply chains it could be that one firm desires identification with another for recognition by association. A supplier might wish to be seen as a supplier of a well-known, reputable organisation. And finally we have expert power, which derives from the possession of expertise, knowledge and talent. And in the supply chain it could be the perception that one firm holds information or expertise that is valued by another firm. So these 5 sources of power, you need to be able to describe them, but also apply to them to the case study and how they might be used. Other researchers have added connection power as a source of power, where the person attains influence by gaining favour or simple acquaintance with a powerful person. This power is all about networking. So power results from personal or professional access to key influencers. There is also informational power, which is the most transitory type of power. Once you give your information away, you lose your power. And then there's negative power, which, as a simple example, if B doesn't like A, then he or she will consciously or not undermine A's efforts. So these aren't attributed particular to any particular researcher, but are just additional sources which you could refer to. What are some of the problems with using power? Well, particularly coercive power. It's exploitive, could be classed as bullying, could demotivate, it could damage relationships, it doesn't bring about sustained change of attitude or commitment, it could lead to compliance but not commitment, it may cause resentment, retaliation, and even in the worst case, litigation. So you need to be aware of some of the problems of coercive power. Expert power can come from staff authority, term given to the expert power of a specialist giving advice or guidance to others, even though they haven't direct line authority. Functional authority is the term where an expert is given legitimate authority to direct the activities of others in the area of his expertise. So there would be your functional supervisor. Sources and indicators of power. Well, within organisations, sources of power come from hierarchy, influence, control of resources, knowledge, control of human environment, perhaps involvement with the implementation of strategy or changes. And the indicators of power linked to this are your status within the organisation, claim on resources, representation and symbols. And for external stakeholders, power comes from control of strategic resources, scarce raw materials, involvement in the implementation of strategy, possession of knowledge and skills, or through internal links. And the indicators are status, resource dependence, negotiating arrangement and symbols. We move now on to controlling organisations. Control can be direct, it can be standardised or specialised, it can be influencing, it can be around performance targets and KPIs, and we've also got the concept of self-control. So a range of terminology there associated with controlling organisations, never examined. The power dependency matrix is useful to bring into exam questions on where the power lies and why power lies in a particular area, and this is the for grid box where the importance of resources to either party is emphasised, and if it's important to both parties, A and B are interdependent, their futures are entwined, but of course if one is important and the other isn't, we get the various combinations. So the power dependency matrix is a useful grid for analysing potential sources of power. Power in supply chains may have the effect or the use of leverage of disempowering suppliers, squeezing margins, forcing suppliers to pursue unsustainable practices, passing top-down pressures down the chain, robbing the buying organisation of benefits of supply chain input, and maybe stimulating scrutiny from regulatory bodies, media and pressure groups. So they can all be the impact of using power in supply chain. But there are positive uses of power. Expert power may be used to develop and empower suppliers. Referent power may be used to share and benchmark best practice standards and to secure supply chain emulation of the buyer's sustainability standards. Reward power may be used to exercise responsible influence over the supply chain to secure compliance with desired sustainable standards. Reward power may be used to develop required capabilities, and reward power can also be exercised responsibly by the buying company through fair and sustainable pricing rather than using leverage. 3.2 then, moving on to tactics that can influence stakeholders, and we have the proactive influencing tactics from UCL, which we've looked at already in section 2, and new to this section is the psychological principles of influence, which are largely attributed to Cialdini. So just 2 bullet points here: proactive influencing tactics and psychological principles of influence. Remembering, of course, the question could say evaluate the main tactics that can be used to influence stakeholders within the case study scenario. If the question is the larger outcome, then the answer is a range of proactive influencing tactics or some of the psychological principles of influence. Occasionally the question will just ask for influencing tactics, or the question could be simply focused on principles of influence. Be very careful. Influencing is not a single event, it's continual. It need not be intentional. It need not involve conferring, need not end with an explicit joint agreement. Influencing need not involve compromise or movement. So it's different than negotiation, but it's an important part of negotiation. What are the objectives of influencing? Well, the outcomes could be resistance, people don't want to do. It could be compliance, where people will do, but it's not hearts and minds. Internalisation is hearts and minds, where they agree and do it willingly, and that's the desired probably outcome of influence. We can, as a general approach or a strategy it may be called, we could use a push approach where we're trying to force something through, and a more cooperative approach would be, or strategy would be, a pull approach where we're using persuasion, interpersonal influence, and it can secure commitment. It's the best method. The 9 influencing tactics, which I've emphasised heavily in Learning Outcome 2 that you must be familiar with. This will be examined in question 2 and or question 3. And there are a range of influencing tactics that UCL and FARB have proposed, which start really with the pull, going right through to the bottom, which is the push tactics. So we've got the rational persuasion, inspirational appeal, consultation, ingratiation, exchange, personal appeal, coalition, legitimating, and pressure. Now these simply have to be learned. There is no shortcut, no getting around them. You must learn these. Which method you will use will depend on the situation, how much power you might have, and whether you're trying to influence upwards, downwards, or across. Remember from section 2 we had managing in 4 directions. So the 9 influencing explored a little more here, where we've got the approach, the advantages, and the disadvantages, and they're fairly straightforward. That some are less adversarial and leading to more cooperation, but may perhaps take more time to get the required action. So we've got ingratiation, exchange, personal appeal, and on the next slide here we've got the more coercive tactics at the bottom of pressure, moving up to legitimating and coalition there. So very important tactics there. How else might we influence and persuade people to come to our way of thinking? Well, we can use the win-win tactics, which you should remember from the negotiation unit. Try to expand the pie by trying to, instead of haggling over limited resources, aim to find ways of increasing the resources, so it's value creating. The use of log rolling, where we're trying to get movement on issues that are more important to us and less important to the supplier. We could offer non-specific compensation. We can try and cut the costs of compliance. And bridging is a technique where we're trying to reframe or reformulate the issues so that entirely new win-win solutions can be developed. So some win-win options there. Very important now, some centres will have covered Cialdini in the negotiation unit. It used to be part of the old syllabus but wasn't on the new one, so you may not have come across Cialdini's 6 principles. The 6 principles are social proof, commitment, reciprocation, liking, authority, and scarcity. So 6 principles here. What does this mean? Well, Cialdini was interested in compliance, and it led him to ask, what are the factors that cause one person to say yes to another person, and which techniques most effectively use these factors to bring about such compliance. And Cialdini wrote a very famous textbook on influence in 1984, and it sold over 2 million copies, and I think was translated into 27 different languages. A very important piece of work. It's largely used in marketing and selling, so that people in that area understand how to close sales, how to influence people. So the principles again: reciprocation, you scratch my back, I'll scratch yours. Commitment, be consistent. Individuals have a strong desire to behave consistently, so having a consistent approach. Authority, people are more willing to follow directions of someone whom they attribute to have relevant authority or expertise. Social validation, individuals are inclined to see the action of others, especially others similar to themselves, as providing guidance for their own decisions. So if everybody else is buying a product, the salesperson is going to say, well, you know, all educated people would understand or buy this. So it's social validation. If other people are doing it in a similar situation to you, that would convince you. Scarcity, well, if you don't buy it this week, it's gone, now or never. And like in friendship, the personal, people prefer to say yes to individuals they know and like. So salespeople will try to be your friend. So 6 Principles of Influence there from Cialdini, and I'd strongly advise you to watch the YouTube video, which is in the recommended videos, which I can forward to if you email. Facilitative communication skills. So what are these? Well, they're the use of questions and answers to support information exchange. They're presenting complex arguments in manageable chunks, segments, summarising each section, asking for feedback, and sensitivity and flexibility to respond to verbal and non-verbal signals. So it's the use of active listening, and it's using your emotional intelligence skills. Rapport-building techniques, matching, mirroring, picking up of technical words, picking up on the other person's dominant way of experiencing and expressing things, listening attentively, nodding, agreeing, remembering and using people's names. All techniques are building rapport. And there's a slide here on NLP, which is in the study guide and is widely used in training programs. It was developed by Bandler and Grinder. And it's about, for want of a simple expression, training people's minds and thoughts. And there's some particular techniques here: mirroring, pacing, leading, mental rehearsal, framing, positioning, intentional use of language to shift thought and behavioural patterns. The science is perhaps not that strong behind NLP, and it isn't something that you could be asked about in your exam, but it's certainly you're going to come across in your working life. NLP, personally, I don't think it's of a great benefit, but that's a personal opinion. But just remember my thoughts there, that it cannot be examined. It could be useful to bring into a question of perhaps how to change behaviours in people. And finally we move on to 3.3, equality and diversity, which you will have definitely studied at level 5 in your management unit. And the unit content is very, very similar. Defining diversity, benefits of diversity, and the impact of discrimination, harassment and victimisation. Finally, developing and implementing policies to enhance diversification. So what is equality, diversity, inclusion? Equality, treating people equally. Diversity, recognising and encouraging and accommodating differences. So people are different in many ways. Inclusion in both a social and educational context means recognising every individual's right to be treated equally and to be accorded the same services and opportunities as everybody else. So fairly straightforward definitions, learn them. Characteristics of diversity. Well, how are people different? Well, there are primary categories such as genetic characteristics, age, race, ethnicity, gender, physical abilities, sexual and affectional orientation, and then referred to as primary categories. And secondary categories are more learnt characteristics that a person acquires and modifies throughout life, which include education, work experience, income, marital status, religious beliefs, etc., etc. And they'll all impact on organisational behaviour. A good answer on diversity will be able to distinguish between primary categories and secondary categories, as well as being able to define the term diversity. Diversity competency is about fostering an environment of inclusion, learning from individuals, teams, developing awareness, attitudes and behaviours that are supportive, and demonstrating commitment to work with teams and value their contribution regardless of personal attributes or differences. And there are many benefits of diversity. Sort of generic one here is widening recruitment pool, performance benefits by being able to draw on people with diverse skills, reflecting the diversity of external stakeholders, benefits of staff morale, customer satisfaction and loyalty, enhanced employer brand. You may become an employer of choice, compliance with equal ops legislation, and enhanced flexibility and learning. So we've got quite a good list there of benefits. Slide here from the January 17 exam, which talks about the benefits to the Siemens case study to the workforce of diversity. And they list here a very similar list: widening recruitment pool, diversity in skills, so you can develop new products markets, diversity in terms of underrepresented groups. The organisation may better reflect the diversity of its external stakeholders, which might enable better understanding of requirements of customers and markets, may improve staff morale, customer satisfaction, enhances the employer's brand, diversity, compliance with legislation, etc., etc. So an application there which is worth a look at the January 17 paper, and you may be asked to give 5-6 benefits of diversity. Problems though with diversity: it can be seen as a burden and a cost of formulating and administrating the policies and practices. It can be quite difficult to manage and communicate effectively in ethically diverse teams, perhaps. Difficulties and costs of managing a diverse workforce, confronting issues of literacy, numeracy and differences in different nations' qualifications and training schemes can be a problem. Adapting the work environment to support disabled employees perhaps is a cost. Perhaps potential for misunderstanding, miscommunication and conflict through enhanced diversity. They are not reasons not to have a diverse supply base or workforce, but some of the issues that you need to be aware of. What is unlawful discrimination? Well, it can be both direct and indirect, and examples are victimisation, harassment or discrimination arising from a disability. There are legitimate exceptions where you can discriminate, and this would be a sort of form of positive discrimination if an employer can show a particular protected characteristic essential to a particular job. Now a good example wouldn't be Santa Claus must have a beard, because obviously you can wear a beard, but it's something similar to that. An employer can take into account a protected characteristics where not doing so would break another law. If there is a need to safeguard national security, if an employer is a religion or belief organisation, it may require a job applicant to hold that belief. And I don't think people would think that's unrealistic. Other companies such as education establishments, civil armed services may require particular characteristics. I'll be very careful of saying physical characteristics. Specific provisions: the Equality Act must avoid all forms of discrimination. You may take positive action to encourage people from groups with a track record of disadvantage or low participation. So you may actively seek to recruit from a particular minority group. You may not ask job applicants about their health and safety or even age. You may not refuse to employ a woman because she's pregnant, suffering pregnancy-related illness or maternity leave. So that's a no-go. How do we implement diversity? Pretty standard formulation: analyse the environment, carefully define diversity and its benefits, appoint equal opportunity champions, and there's certainly been equal opportunity champions in some of the case studies. Establish a representative working party to formulate policies, codes, communicate and promote the policy, and walk the walk and talk the talk. So support implementation through processes, monitor, benchmark at regular intervals. So a very important process there of implementing diversity. Supply diversity can be important. and it's certainly an aim of many organisations to have a diverse supply base. It can support strategic alignment by ensuring supply base reflects increasing diversity of the customer base, helps build stakeholder relations, generate goodwill. It supports corporate image and reputation, and it contributes to improved supply chain performance. A wider pool of suppliers can generate competition and innovation. It should, if done well, will reduce risk, and there will be many other benefits. An audit problem related to diversity from the March 17 exam. The question was, category buyers will be required to audit the extent which suppliers have implemented RBC's new policy on equality and diversity. Suggests some difficulties for RBC in auditing the equality and diversity practices. Well, the answer is slightly generic, but differences in culture between RBC and suppliers leading to differences in interpretation, which is a common cultural problem. Communication issues, language differences, different time zones, potential power imbalance between RBC and its suppliers, the possible geographical distance, so the actual time, cost and resources needed. The next bullet points, increasing costs in the process, and suppliers may try and hide their actual practice on the day of the audit, and that's the problem with all audits. Do you really see what happens there, and normal working practices, or is it a show that's just put on? So some fairly general problems there with auditing, but related to auditing diversity. How do we improve supply diversity? Well, remove the barriers to participation in competing for contracts. Make sure small businesses can apply, make sure maybe reduce the job lots, maybe make the supplier selection process more straightforward, many ways. So reduce barriers, positive action diversity programs where suppliers in certain underrepresented groups are targeted, and encourage or require suppliers to have diversity policies in place for their own supply chains. And some suppliers may indeed need help and guidance on how to devise a diversity policy. Group learning. What is the purpose of group learning? To give each individual a greater insight into his own behaviour, to understand intra-group processes, to develop individual skills, to develop appreciation and management of diversity, and to encourage people to learn from each other, sharing knowledge and skills. So group learning, important aspects of diversity. Problems of groups, we can get groupthink, where you get moral blindness, stereotyping, group pressure to quell dissent, a perception of unanimity, filtering out, ignoring divergent views, and mutual support and solidarity to guide the decision. So there is a danger of groupthink. How do we lead diverse teams? Well, we need to acknowledge cultural conflicts when they arise and encourage mutual learning. Identify and focus on shared values and common ground. We need to clarify expectations and gain commitment to the group's shared goals and objectives. Identify individual interests, strengths and preferences, and showing appreciation and respect for different cultural contributions. Flexibly exploring cultural appropriate ways of team building. Being sensitive to power imbalances and supporting all member contributions, and facilitating communication and feedback processes. So a fairly straightforward list of factors to consider when we're leading diverse teams. And some more ideas here for managing diversity. 10 ideas. Test assumptions before acting on them. Ensure organisational discipline and policies are clearly understood. Similar, make sure diversity policies are understood and acted upon. Maintain good channels of communication to locate possible problems before they become problems. Learn how to understand views of staff members, be prepared to listen, learn about and have regard for strongly held beliefs held by individuals, acknowledge contributions to working environments and processes, know your own cultural diversity biases at work and not let them affect the workplace. Unconscious bias can be a problem. Take care that any workplace-based social events can be enjoyed by all workers, and they aren't aimed at only one group or type. So a useful list there. It is very similar to the previous sliding. It's perhaps more practical. And this ends session 3. Learning outcome 3 is particular tight and it's got a very small range of theory. We've got the sources of power, which if you learn the French and Raven, you will be able to answer the vast majority of exam questions. So French and Raven, sources of power. Learning outcome 3.2 is ultimately only about Yuckel and Falb's influencing tactics, but perhaps new to you is Cialdini's principles of influence. So get familiar with those. And then finally 3.3 is around the issues of equality and diversity, where you need to learn the standard definitions, benefits of diversity, and perhaps some of the methods of implementing diversity and possible issues with diversity. So it's a nice, straightforward learning outcome is 3. Thank you.